This
Good
is Brett
afternoon.
Andrews. Good afternoon,
Great.
everyone.
We'll be with you momentarily.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we live?
Yes, Chair Moore, we are.
Okay.
I believe it's taken care of. Sorry about that.
Okay. We will now move to our next agenda item, but before we do so, I would like to say welcome back from the lunch break, and I will turn to Parliamentarian Johnson so that a roll call vote may be established for
Yes.
quorum.
Yes, ma'am. Chair Moore,
Present.
Vice Chair Brown.
Present.
Vice Chair Brown is present. Member Bradford. Member Grills.
Present.
Member Holder.
Present.
Member Jones Sawyer. I'm sorry, was that a yes? Member Lewis.
Present.
Member Tamaki.
Present.
Member Montgomery Steppe.
Here.
Madam Chair, there are a total of 7 members present. The quorum is 5. A quorum is established or reestablished.
Okay. Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. So the meeting is now back in order, given that a quorum has been established. So we will now turn to agenda item number 7, which is a discussion of the community of eligibility. And of course, for folks who have been engaged throughout this entire process, discussion item number 7 is a continuation of an ongoing conversation that we've been having on the community of eligibility. In the past, we've invited other expert witnesses to speak on this issue, and today we are honored to have Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, present with us so that she can impart on us her insight to the question of the community of eligibility. So, do we have Secretary Weber present with us at this moment? Oh, yes,
I'm here.
we do.
Yeah, I'm here. Yes.
Well, hi, welcome. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Go. Oh, I was just going to say welcome. And before we get into, the concept of community of eligibility, if you could, Secretary Weber, as, a grounding exercise, remind us of, the vision that you had more broadly as it relates to this task force and its potential, please.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be back with you again, and I'm pleased that my staff, Dominique, has been attending all meetings and briefing me on the task force and all of the information that's there. So where I've not been with you in person, I have definitely had my staff and my resources paying attention and making recommendations and engaging me in the conversation concerning reparations. I want to thank the chair and those of you on the committee for the work that you've done. The dedication that you have to this effort is extremely important. And I want to thank you for serving on this committee, this task force. The work that you're doing, I know will have a profound impact on all Californians and this nation as well. I've been contacted by many as a result as the author of AB 3121 concerning what we're doing, how far we've gotten, as well as what my intent was when I authored the bill and put it on the floor of the Assembly and the Senate and lobbied to get it signed by the governor. As you know, the national debate concerning reparation has been going on for approximately 40 years without clear resolution and improvement. Some cities have taken it upon themselves to bring the discussion and provide some compensation for many who have been adversely affected by slavery in their economies, as well as looking at the devastation that it has had on African American communities, that has resulted in enormous wealth gap in this nation that will take decades to close if no aggressive intervention occurs. AB 3121 was a major milestone for California and this nation. California, I believed, and is the largest state in the union. It is the 5th largest economy in the world, and one of the and interestingly enough, one of the farthest states away from what we would consider the Deep South, the heart of Dixie. However, the information you have discovered in your hearing shows that even being as far away from Dixie as one could possibly get physically, California nonetheless has been impacted by the system of slavery, and those who live in California have been the victims of systems, whether it's Jim Crow laws or restrictions in housing or being placed in schools that were dysfunctional and so forth and so on, that there was no hiding place from slavery in this nation. And so it becomes important and even an example for the rest of the nation, hopefully to begin to look at themselves, because if California, as far as we were, if slavery was as pervasive here as it is across the nation, it says that clearly there needs to be a lot more work done in other states, and there needs to be a national effort at that. Some ask me, why didn't we do the national effort? And I had to say what so often has been said, how long, not long, can we wait for some resolution to the issue? Langston Hughes talked about waiting for things that are so long that before you know it, the dogs are biting at your door, because obviously others are still organizing against you as you make an effort to try to be patient, to be thoughtful, and to try to move an agenda. So it is important, as I've indicated to so many when I authored AB 3121, that I realized that many of the issues that are going to be addressed in this bill have not been resolved. There are a lot of unresolved issues, but I realized that it would have taken a lifetime of conversation and discussion for me to resolve them all. And by then I would not have the opportunity to author this bill and get it passed in the houses. I always say we will not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If every system we has some challenges and some flaws and some issues that have to be worked out. If we solved all of those issues before we gave any unemployment check, we would have people across this nation suffering as a result of the virus, because it is an imperfect system. And yet there are many who may take advantage of it, but the vast majority will benefit from it. And so it was in that spirit that I did not make an attempt to solve all of the issues that people wanted me to solve. I listened to conversations from many, but I realized that there was no greater time and no greater opportunity than now for the bill for reparations to be brought to California and resolved here at this time, given the politics of California, given the efforts that I had made with so many strides in terms of getting ethnic studies and all those kinds of bills into California, that this was the time, and no better person than myself, because I have generally been relatively courageous about those issues that are important and challenging to California to do so. So with that in mind, this is not a perfect bill. It's a good bill. And it requires from you the kind of conversation that needs to happen about who gets what. And so I want to share with you today my thinking and my conversation that occurred as I was authoring the bill, interacting with a number of communities and groups to help you understand what takes place. Slavery surely had an impact on the African. There is no question. Being denied access to one's worth, in other words, the ability to work and make money, kept generations of Africans in dire poverty. We provided free labor to this country for hundreds of years, and that had an impact upon us as a population, as a people. If you ever get a chance to listen to the voices of former slaves that were recorded in the 1930s as a result of the New Deal and the efforts to come out of depression, there were a number of anthropologists who recorded the voices of those who had been slaves. And when you listen to it on the Smithsonian tapes, those tapes were basically ruined because of weather, but they kept them, and because of digitization, now we have the voices of slaves that we can hear. It is interesting as you listen to it that they say very clearly that when slavery ended, when slavery was no longer legal, they literally had nothing but the scraps on their back. They didn't own any property. They did not own any equipment. They owned no land. They had no sense of direction. So often they could tell the north and the south because of the sun and the things they'd heard, but they had nothing. They had no place to sleep, no place to stay. And as a result of that, most of them only had the skills of farming, which became the foundation for the sharecropping system. The few Africans who worked in the big house knew that they knew how to serve and how to iron clothes and how to wait on individuals. And they were the first ones who left, because they knew when the research was done that they had sat in the big house and listened to the plans for sharecropping. And they knew it would be no more than another wave of slavery, a different kind of slavery. And so those who had skills left and went north. And they tried to create for themselves a position of service in terms of having some level of business or working in houses, because they knew how to do that. But the vast majority of them basically ended up being sharecroppers, the victims of a system that kept them forever poor. And I know that because my grandfather was a sharecropper, and my great-grandfather, who was born in slavery, was also a sharecropper, and my daddy was a sharecropper. And thus, when my family left in August of 1951, Arkansas, in the middle of the night, running from the Klan, it was because the sharecropping system was so brutal and was unrelenting, and therefore left him with nothing but poverty. The end of slavery also increased brutality to blacks, so that those who suffered in slavery also suffered the brutality that existed. One researcher talked about the fact that when you were a slave, you had economic value. If anyone hit you, hurt you, or shot you, they would have to pay your master for your body, for what your labor would have been. But once slavery ended, you had no economic value at all, which meant anyone could shoot you, kill you, lynch you, burn you, and they owed no one anything for your life. And so that made Africans even more vulnerable as a result of the system that came into existence in terms of the Jim Crow laws that were there. So the ability to exercise your constitutional right to vote, the appearance in courts, the fighting back, were all tantamount to signing a death sentence for the average African. I could go on recounting the economic and the social indignities that were upheld and supported by the courts in this land. Those became the basis for discussion of who deserves reparations. Slavery was more than a physical condition. The psychological impact it had on the aspirations of Africans was promoted through open violence without protection of the law. Lynching and burning to keep Africans in their place caused generations to place limitations on one's ability to strive for excellence. My grandfather was in Arkansas during the Elaine, Arkansas riot. The killings lasted for weeks as black men were hunted in the fields because they had the audacity to attempt to organize and collectively bargain for fairness at the sharecroppers. The fear of that, the killing of hundreds of Africans and hunting them down for weeks, was designed to create a sense of fear and limitation on the visions of Africans because there was no system to provide them with support. The fear my grandfather felt, I remember as a child, was palatable, and it crippled him and his family's ability to dream beyond the cotton fields. He was dearly, dearly, and direly afraid that his kids would be killed, his sons would be murdered, his wife would be raped, his daughters would have things done to him that he could not defend them. And that in itself created such a tremendous fear and psychological impact that Black people almost did not dream of anything other than mere survival. And that becomes important as we talk about the impact of slavery versus those who were never slaves, who came to this country from other places, who had aspirations and visions themselves. I often think about Barack Obama, and my theory is always that Barack Obama probably would never have had the aspirations to be president of the United States if one of his parents had been a slave. His father was an African, a Kenyan, who came to this country to go to school, and he was born of a white woman who also had dreams and aspirations of greatness herself. He did not have limitations and fears drilled in his psyche, and thus aspired to become the president of the United States. Reparations is designed to repair and heal the damage done to Africans for 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow. Recent immigrants do not share our common oppression at the same level. And I say this because I have numerous friends who are recent immigrants and a son-in-law who's a recent immigrant. They can trace their ancestors. My son-in-law is a Kenyan. And when we went to Kenya, we were able to see hundreds and hundreds of family members who could trace their lineage all the way back for hundreds of years. We visited the burial sites of his grandfather, who was one of the chiefs of the Kikuyu. And my grandkids had an opportunity to touch the hands of ancestors that went back for generations, and to see pictures and to visit grave sites. Things that I have limited knowledge of and access only go up until maybe 1870, but not to the depth as that my son-in-law experiences. Reparation is for those who are the descendants of slaves first, because of the devastation they suffered from hundreds of years of no wages and no ability to own land and accrue wealth. Their ties are permanently severed from their homeland, and their ability to return to Africa is almost impossible. We are truly, unfortunately, Americans. I am a living witness to that, having traveled to the continent for dozens of times over the last 30 years, have met and gone to see folks whose villages I'm supposed to know, have interacted supposedly with former relatives, and I come back each time happy that I went, but clearly aware of the fact that I am truly an American. That slavery stole from me my ancestry and my heritage. And no matter how I wear African clothes as I have, and many of you have been to my house to see my collection of fabulous African art, the reality I come back with every year is that I have nowhere to go but here. That is not the case for those who are immigrants in this country, who come here from Africa, who still maintain their ties and their relationships, who still own land in their homeland, in their country, and can always return and have for them a sense of pride and dignity about who they are and where they are. I remember once in reading a story of the author of They Came Before Columbus. And he was talking about him came before the Mayflower. And he was talking about being in Ghana when Ghana got its freedom in 1960, in the 1960s. And Lerone Bennett was talking about watching those around him crying at their freedom, their love for their country, and how he felt like such an alien in the world because his homeland had been stolen from him, but equally important, he had not been completely embraced here. And so he didn't have the same sense of love and tears that he saw. And he felt so much that he was left without a homeland and without a place. African immigrants freely come to the United States in search of a better life should not be eligible for reparations. Whether they found a better life or not, they could always immigrate back to their homeland and reestablish themselves with their indigenous families. The debate may continue, but there is one thing that I am very clear about. Those who are descendants of slaves had and have the impact of that system living in them and either driving and altering their aspirations. Those who were free during that time frame also may be able to should be able to make their case about themselves, because so often, if you lived here in the 1800s or the 1700s and you were free, you still had the impact of slavery on your life. The ability to move, the ability to own property was often taken away. Many of you have seen the movie 12 Years as a Slave. If you were free, you had to validate your existence every day, and someone could take your identity card and tear it up, and you immediately became a slave. That your whole existence depended upon someone validating, that someone white basically arguing your case for you in terms of your freedom. So those who lived during the slave period, and even if they were free, were never fully free and did not have access to the resources oftentimes that they needed to maintain their life and to be free. So I'm very clear about a couple of things. One is that I would never have written this bill if I thought at some point in the process of providing reparations that I would look at the line, if there was such a thing as a look at the line, that those standing in line for reparations, and that I would discover that those at the front of the line were those who had very limited, if any, impact at all from slavery. I would be very upset if I discovered that only those who had the resources, who had the greatest amount of information, who had been more prepared than others, found themselves at the front of the line. And those who suffered the most from generation to generation out of slavery, from poverty and lack of resources, would find themselves once again at the end of the line because they got the message late. We didn't do enough to basically help them to understand that they had been the victims of a poor educational system that did not prepare them for the university. And as a result, they did not benefit from it at all. Chemerinsky talks about it. I was reading in your last report, what my staff gave me, that he said it's an issue of not about being Black. It's an issue of descendancy and lineage. And he's absolutely correct. There will be many Black people who do not deserve reparations, but there will be many who, obviously, whose lineage, and they are Black, and their lineage clearly says very strongly that they deserve to have reparations. Reparations is about harm that has been done, its extent, and who basically should have that harm mitigated by some form of repair to that individual. So I hope I'm clear about what I meant at the time. We had conversations, and that's why one of the things talks about basically those who are descendants of slaves being handled first, and others may be secondary. Those others secondary are those who were impacted by slavery, who lived in the United States during slavery, who may have been free, but also had their visions limited because of the slave system itself that did not treat them equal. They were not treated as equal citizens. They had limited ability, and they also could become vulnerable as a result of the system of slavery. Those who came after slavery, who may have experienced Jim Crow, who may have done various things, came here with their lineage intact, came here with their resources intact, and came here oftentimes looking for a better life. We did not. We were kidnapped, brought here against our will. All of our past was taken from us, and we truly have nowhere else to go but here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, California Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, for your expert testimony on the concept of the community of eligibility. So we have 5 minutes left for this conversation. So I would like to provide space now for our esteemed task force members to ask any questions or to provide any comments or insight based on Dr. Shirley, our Secretary of State Shirley Weber's testimony. Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think our Secretary of State is very clear as to why she authored this legislation. And it had to do with righting the wrongs that have been perpetrated against those who were enslaved in this country. Thanks to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the research that they did on my family tree, I got the confirmation that going back 5 generations, my great-great-great-grandfather, Patrick Brown, was born enslaved at a place called Roxy in Franklin County, Mississippi, the same hamlet where Richard Wright was born, who wrote Black Boy, Native Son. So I'm very clear. There's no disregard for those who are from the motherland who happen to have come to this country. But we need to deal with the scene of the crime that was perpetrated against us here in America by a system that treated us as being tools and not human beings.
Thank you. Senator Bradford, member holder. I might have seen someone else's hand, but Senator Bradford and then member holder.
Okay. Well, first, thank you, Dr. Weber, for your leadership and courage, your 8 years in the legislature, and it's truly been an honor to work with you and you to continue your leadership and passion now as Secretary of State, and I appreciate you for authoring this bill. I just had a question. Last month, I was in Atlanta, and I had opportunity to pose the question of reparations to Andrew Young, and I was surprised at his answer. It fell along the lines of how you described descendants and folks who were directly impacted by slavery, but he added a caveat. He thought there were whites who were enslaved that should also be entitled to reparations. I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
You know, one of the challenges, obviously, and there will always be somebody who can find someone exceptional and different. If there were whites who were enslaved, there was whites who were indentured servants. They were not legally enslaved in this country by law. Additionally, if they ran away, they were no longer a slave. We could be tracked down. The reason why we were kept in slavery not easily, but for so long, is that if we left, people knew who we were. You could run to the next town, put on some different clothes, and no one would know you if you were white, if you really wanted to leave. And so there were various levels of servitude that existed in this country, but none as pervasive and none upheld by law as it was for Africans in this country. But like I said, we were very visible. So if there was a white person who remained in slavery, they must have wanted to stay, because they could have run away and they could have been who knows what, probably president of the United States. Is the way things go in this country in a short period of time. So spending time looking for the exception to the rule and ignoring the reality of all of us, all of these folks here still in need, is ridiculous. I appreciate Andrew Young and his desire to be, compassionate to the world, and that's important. But our compassion oftentimes has not served us well. And I hope people realize that this is a time, after all of these years, that we could hopefully make a difference. We have allowed, as I always say, we are the ones who kick down the door of opportunity, and everybody runs over our back and grabs all the stuff off the table. And when we get up, most of the stuff is gone. That is the reality of all of our movements in this country. And we care, and it's good that we have compassion for everyone. But every now and then, we have to be basically not selfish, but surely interested in making sure that we actually solve the problem that we face, and not find ourselves another 100 years from now talking about the impact of slavery.
Member Holder.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Secretary of State Dr. Weber, for your visionary leadership and for convening us all here. So my question for you, I'm looking at the framework that you just provided for us, and it was very, very clear. And I thank you for that. And that framework really focuses in on, the psychological harm of being completely disconnected from your beginning, right? From your roots. And as you explained, if you are from Africa and you immigrated to the United States at some point, you can still go back, and that's still your home. My question is specifically around the fact that slavery was a hemispheric economy, very much in the Western Hemisphere, where Black people were being traded through all of the Americas, through the Caribbean, into the United States, back and forth, just a commodity. And those folks from the Caribbean and from other parts of the hemisphere who were enslaved have the same disconnection from their past, from their roots, as those of us enslaved in the United States. And many of us have now come together, all of us with that disconnected, with that disconnected ancestry. Regardless of what part of the Western Hemisphere we're from, whether we're from the Caribbean or from the States. And so I wanted to get your perspective on people who, the enslavement in the Caribbean was notorious. You know, there are parts of the Caribbean where, as an adult enslaved, this enslavement was so brutal that you had a 10-year lifespan in places like Haiti. So for people from the Caribbean who are now in the United States, who have come like throughout the 19th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century, what is your perspective on that?
Well, you know, and don't get me wrong. I know that the impact of slavery was universal around the world. I mean, you had examples, and you still have examples of the mistreatment of people in Europe, and the impact that it has, and new things that are developing every day. And I understand. I've been to all of the countries that the Caribbeans and the countries that you've talked about, down to Brazil and all around, to see all of those things. And as I said, I've traveled to all of those places. Many of those places still have intact much more cultural relevance than we have. Slavery is different in every, as you discovered, in every country. It's very different. When I go to Brazil, I discovered that there's far more cultural relevance and philosophy and ideology and understanding there of their African roots and the things that drive them than they are here. And that's because that system was, where it may have been brutal at some point, it also had other elements of it that were much more supportive of them. And so we can go on and on. I'm dealing with what the United States responsibility is. If we decide to solve all of the problems around the world, we will probably get 50 cents each. And that will be the end of it. I think those in other countries should also be dealing with the countries that they came from, that they put their labor in. You know, we look at the fact that we work for free in this country for over 100 years and continue to work and built this nation. And so that is important. And it doesn't diminish the impact of Africans in Jamaica, as I've been to visit there, and Brazil and the Caribbean and you know, just I've been to most of the countries, and it doesn't. And each one has a different sense of legacy, a different system, and their country owes them things. And many of them are the majority in those countries. They're the majority. They're not the minority. And so, and their politics is different, and those kinds of things. And I think if we set out to try to solve the issues of people from other places, we will find ourselves with very little. And that's why I said I would hope that the perfect would not be the enemy of the good, that we would try to solve every problem that's out there and find ourselves with a group of people in this country who built this nation, who work for free in this country, not able to basically find any sense of reparation as a result of it. So I'm not in favor of opening up this to all kinds of folks, because I think if it gets too complicated, the history and the rationale for people coming to this country is very different. And those who came here thought it was a better system than where they came from. And it may be true. You know, I have students from Haiti who came to the United States. They thought it was a better system. But they still have relatives and family members in Haiti. And they still have a lot of lineage and history in Haiti. So I'm not into... this is really about the American system of slavery and those who helped build this nation and what this country owes them as a result of us building the largest and the strongest nation in the world, period. Not everybody else. And that does not take away from anyone else. And anyone else who wants to write a reparation bill in their country, I will help them do that. But this is about this country, those who worked so hard to build this nation, and what the United States owes those individuals who built this country.
Member Gross, you're recognized.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. This is very helpful what you have shared today. I just have two quick questions for you. The first question is, I'm trying to reconcile what you've shared today with what is in the AB 3121. In particular, there's a phrase in there that trips me up. And the phrase is under Article 2, and it says that the task force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the U.S. What does it mean, a special consideration? Because for me, that opened the door to,
Right.
particularly because later on, in the bill, it talks about the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery, which are all of the different forms of structural racism that anybody Black in this country deals with. So how do I reconcile that?
Well, as I said in some of my comments earlier, that there's no question that those who were actually slaves in this country should be considered first. If there is any, if you're going to rank them, that they are the ones who had the most dire impact. It also says that there are some of those, as I said, who had an impact in slavery because they lived here during slavery. They were folks who lived here, who came here. Some of them came in indentured servants and then were turned into slaves. Some were allowed to go free. But those people had their lives also directly impacted. They did not basically operate as a regular citizen in the United States. They were, some of them actually worked alongside the slaves in the various plantations. Some of them could be kidnapped and taken back into it. So I say those who are actually the descendants of slaves who could not move about, who had no mobility, and who were owned and could be, things could happen to them, but who were actually owned by somebody in this country should be the ones who basically are the first and given the first consideration for any reparations that we do. Then those who were secondary would be those who lived, who still had an impact. Slavery had an impact on their life because they lived through it. They could be captured and taken into slavery. They could be beaten in the streets and had to basically alter their existence as a result of the system itself. Those of you who study the history of this country know that those who came here initially as indentured servants came as regular folks, but as the slave system developed, they became second-class citizens. They couldn't be out at night in the dark. They couldn't assemble. They couldn't, those individuals had their lives completely limited. They couldn't sit in the first row of the church. We know that with the churches that developed and all those kinds of things. And life was so bad for them that they had conventions every year to try to basically fight the slave system. And they argued on its behalf because of what the things they were suffering. So those folks had a direct contact with slavery. Slavery was a part of their life. It wasn't something that they read about. It wasn't something that in 1920 somebody comes here, Marcus Garvey comes here from Jamaica, and he hears about it, he learns about it, and those kinds of things. It was not that kind of thing. They actually were the victims of the system themselves, where they may not have been enslaved. They were the victims of it, and they had their opportunities and their visions altered as a result of it, and could actually have all of their resources taken away from them, including their lives.
Okay, thank you. It would have been helpful for that to have been more clearly stated what was meant by special considerations, because it kind of left it open.
Well, one of the things as we were ending the bill, meeting the deadline, this piece was added on at the end to make sure that others could be considered, because there was a concern that those who basically lived through slavery but weren't slaves had impact on their lives. Rather than saying, someone said, well, we should say anybody came here up to 1965 and all this other kind of stuff. So in order to not do that, we said, hey, first let's consider the folks that were slaves here. And then secondarily, we'll look at those that slavery had an impact, a direct impact. And maybe we should have said direct impact. And not just because everybody who lives here is affected by some aspect of slavery. But it's different depending on how you come in here, where you come from, and those kinds of things. And when you interact with those who at least when I interact with friends and family members who were from somewhere else, their reality about who we are and what we do in this country is very different than our reality. Their response is very different. Society's response to an African or a Jamaican is very different. And I say that because it's like when I was in school, it's like those from other countries were exotic people. People liked them because they liked their accent. They liked having these exotic friends. Now, I wasn't exotic because I was a daughter of a former slave. So I wasn't exotic at all, but people embraced those from Africa and embraced those from the Caribbean and other places because they liked the accent, they liked these things. And it was like having a special friend, basically. So their realities are very different. And as a result of that, as I say, as I deal with my son-in-law and his family, their reality of colonialism is very different than our concept of colonialism. and the impact of colonialism in Kenya and opportunities in their mind that was created is totally different than what we saw. And in fact, it's interesting. I was talking with, when I was there, one of the relatives for the first time, and this is a woman, very educated, saw eyes on the prize and had no idea that that was happening in the United States. And she's in her 80s. She had no idea that that's what the King thing was about in this whole movement. And this is a woman who's a teacher and an educator in Kenya. So their realities are totally different than ours. And while it's nice to think about everybody, the reality is we're talking about California, U.S. resources, the economics of this country, the opportunities in this country, and what we're going to do for those who help to build the country.
I'm noticing the time. The other question I have, I guess I could save it for another time or reach out to you.
Okay, or send it to me. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Yes, we are over time, but I wanted to ask a question about, and it's something that's not very discussed much in these conversations about eligibility, but the idea of what about, Californians who might have left the state in recent years because they were priced out? Do you have any thoughts on that? Either in terms of eligibility, you have to be a California resident, or would a birth certificate from the state of California suffice? If you're not prepared to answer that now, that's totally fine.
Because I don't want people double dipping, and I think there will be a lot of folks who left California who live in Indiana, and Indiana now has reparations. That's one of the benefits that would be of having a national program. But given the nature of Washington, it's not likely we're going to have a national program anytime soon. So, but those who are still invested in California, who are still paying taxes in California, using California resources, should be those who benefit from it. We may have a lot of Black people coming back, which would be nice and might boost our population, but before reparations goes in effect. But I think, and that's one of the reasons I say there will always be these issues that we have to resolve. Always be these issues that we have to resolve, and hopefully we will do it in a way that's fair and just to those who are here. But at some point, like anything, if you got to cut the line off. You got to figure out this is what is and what is not. Otherwise, you will spend your whole time talking eligibility, and by the time you've finished, California will have spent all its money because it's got money now, and we will end up with nothing because we can't figure out who to give a quarter to.
Thank you. Any last comments? Okay, we'll close it out with any last comments from our task force members? I see Vice Chair Brown. Anyone else? Okay, Vice Chair Brown.
I think you're muted.
You're on mute.
Madam Chair, members of the task force, let me put it in a biblical, theological terminology. There's an old song that I sang in Sunday school. Brighten the corner where you are. Check it out. Google it. We got to brighten this corner in the state of California. The seat and the scene of the crime. And I agree with our Secretary of State that we are going to go all around the world. We would defeat the moral of that song. Right in the corner where you are. We are hurting in California, in these schools, in these communities, even where our watering holes have been destroyed. What are we going to do at home? That's the fundamental question. And I hope that this task force be committed to the vision and the spirit of our dear Secretary of State and get with it. Not make this a paralysis of an analysis and going around in circles on it. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Secretary Weber. So now we will turn to agenda item number 8, which is our second witness panel of the year and of the day on public health. And we have four people coming to provide expert testimony for the public health panel. So without further ado, I will turn to introducing our expert witnesses. Our first expert witness is Dr. Carolyn Roberts, and Dr. Carolyn Roberts is an historian of medicine and science at Yale University. She holds a joint appointment in the departments of history, history of science and medicine, and African American studies. She also holds a secondary appointment at Yale School of Medicine in the program in history of medicine. Her research interests concern the history of race, science, and medicine in the context of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. This includes attention to the critical role played by African and African-descended medical and health knowledge in the Atlantic world. Dr. Roberts teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in the history of race, science, and medicine from the 16th to the 21st centuries. Her teaching blends history with medical sociology and public health to explore present-day crises related to race, racism, and health. Dr. Roberts received a master's and a PhD from Harvard University, an MA from Andover Newton Theological School, and a Bachelor's of Arts from Dartmouth College. We will then hear from Dr. Tina Sachs. Dr. Tina Sachs is an associate professor at UC Berkeley School of Welfare. Her fields of interest include racial inequities in health, social determinants of health, and poverty and inequality. Professor Sachs focuses on how macro-structural forces, including structural discrimination and immigration, affect women's health. Her current work investigates the persistence of racial and gender discrimination in healthcare settings among racial and ethnic minorities who are not poor. She published a book on the subject entitled Invisible Visits: Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System, and her next major project explores the implications of the infamous U.S. Public Health Service Tuskegee syphilis study on the study's direct descendants. We will then hear from Brett Andrews. Brett Andrews has served as the Chief Executive Officer of San Francisco's based PRC since 2003, whose mission is to help some of the city's most vulnerable people affected by poverty, HIV and AIDS, substance abuse, and mental health issues realize their full potential by providing health and human services to help reclaim their lives. Brett is a co-chair of the San Francisco Human Services Network and is an active leader within the SF HIV/AIDS Provider Network. Our City, Our Home Oversight Committee, the San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force, and the San Francisco Business Times Leadership Trust. Since 2019, Brett has convened the Black Leadership Council, a collection of San Francisco-based Black leaders across local government and human services organizations and other sectors. The council has developed a suite of statewide public policy proposals to improve economic and social conditions for Black Californians. And last but not least, we will hear from Melissa Jones. Melissa Jones is the executive director of the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative. She is passionate about creating the conditions that increase quality of life and makes life more fair for more people. Her work focuses on the intersection of social determinants of health, social inequality, and well-being. Her experience includes work in municipal government and nonprofits in the Bay Area's large and small cities. Melissa is an active community member in Oakland and also serves on the Association of Bay Area Governments Regional Planning Committee, which advises on regional planning issues. Without further ado, I will turn to Dr. Carolyn Roberts. Dr. Carolyn Roberts, are you available? If not, we can go to Dr. Tina Sachs. And I'll also be mindful of the time. We may have to go into our break period. Just putting that out there. Dr.
Hello,
Carolyn Roberts.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, but I can't see you. I see a black screen.
Let me see here. The
Oh, great. See you and hear you.
Oh, good. Wonderful. So thank
You can
you.
begin.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the task force for inviting me to participate in these very important hearings. So this afternoon, I will be discussing the broken relationship between African Americans and the U.S. healthcare system from an historical perspective. And of course, in 15 minutes, this must be necessarily broad. But it's important for us to recognize that many critical issues that we're wrestling with today have long, old, and deep historical roots. These include racial bias and disparate treatment in medicine, race-based medicine, and medical exploitation. So in our historical analysis, we must consider not only American slavery and its afterlives, but also the transatlantic slave trade. Next slide, please. The transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced oceanic migration in human history, and it presented a healthcare challenge that had never existed before. How can you traffic millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic so that they arrive alive and in bendable condition as human property? Next slide, please. The British slave trade is important for all of us gathered here today because the majority of enslaved people who arrived in the United States arrived on board British slave ships. British slave ship medicine was based on systemic violence and dehumanization. Next slide, please. Doctors such as Thomas Trotter were hired to work on board British slave ships. They performed invasive, forced medical inspections. Captives were beaten, kicked, whipped, and punched if they didn't comply. Women and girls were pinned down and their legs were held open so doctors could check to see if they had previously borne children. One observer noted that the women and girls wept uncontrollably. Next slide. On board thousands of slave ships, doctors whipped African captives who refused to eat, lacerating their flesh, and then treating the wounds they had just inflicted upon their patients in order to keep them alive. Medical practitioners were equipped with bolus knives, thumb screws, and the speculum oris to force feed the enslaved, which broke off their teeth in the process. Medical practitioners administered drugs with whips and pistols nearby to force their compliance. They were expected to compel life by any means necessary. Next slide, please. Dr. Isaac Wilson testified before the British Parliament the following. While whipping enslaved people who refused to eat, they smiled at him and said, "Presently, we shall be no more." They wanted to die, and doctors had to compel life. And so a new form of healthcare management entered the world. This was a form of healthcare where medical violence against African and African-descended people became an acceptable, normative, and institutionalized practice for over a century in the context of the British slave trade. This forced Black people into a unique and troubling relationship with Western medicine before even setting foot in the United States. It characterized the kind of medical care that was deemed appropriate for Black people. It also created a new understanding of the doctor-patient relationship, a relationship that was violent and depersonalized, extractive and exploitative. Next slide, please. Upon arrival in the United States, enslaved people were already trying to heal from the trauma, violence, and abuse they experienced in the slave trade healthcare. And throughout the Americas, enslaved people like Lulu Wilson tried to give medical care to one another. They developed their own medical systems. They blended medical knowledge from Africa with new medicinal plants in the Americas. However, they could not avoid white doctors who began to use their bodies to advance medical science. Next slide, please. Newspapers contained advertisements like this one, offering cash for sick enslaved people to be medical specimens. During the 19th century, scientific medicine was beginning to take root in the United States. Doctors needed bodies, both alive and dead, to understand more about how organs and tissues were impacted by disease. There was an enormous demand for sick patients and cadavers for study. Yet the white population would not tolerate their bodies to be used in this manner. Slavery created a population of people who were forced to comply. Next slide, please. This is a slave narrative that was written by an enslaved man named John Brown, who was subjected to painful medical experiments. Yet John Brown was not alone. A slave named Sam was pinned down into a chair by 5 physicians so that his lower jawbone could be removed without anesthesia. Dr. Walter Jones in Virginia poured boiling water on naked enslaved pneumonia patients at 4-hour intervals. Dr. John Hardin stripped blood vessels from the limbs of an enslaved man and from 3 hogs to measure the arteries for comparison. Dr. James Dugas performed experimental eye surgeries on Black subjects. Next slide, please. One of the most important legacies of medical exploitation during slavery concerns the legacy of Black women as the mothers of gynecology. As one British surgeon noted, quote, "You could cut into the bodies of negresses like you did rabbits or dogs," end quote. J. Marion Sims, the doctor who is pictured at the far right, did just that. He conducted experimental surgeries on enslaved women to cure vesicovaginal fistula. Enslaved women, like Anarcha, who is pictured at the center, were operated upon 30 times over a period of 5 years without anesthesia, although ether was available. Sims believed Black women didn't feel as much pain as white women. And so over and over again, he scarified, sutured, and resutured her vagina. When the surgery was finally perfected with silver sutures rather than lead, Sims treated the white women of Montgomery and properly administered anesthesia. Next slide, please. Sims remains a part of our lives today. His vaginal speculum is still used during gynecological exams. Next slide, please. By utilizing the bodies of Black women, doctors advanced their understanding of the surgical cure for vesicovaginal fistula, how to remove burst ovaries, deliver stillborn children, stop intrauterine bleeding, fix fused labias, repair obstetrical fistula, remove ovarian tumors. The first full uterine removal was done on an enslaved woman by Dr. Paul Eve. Cesarean sections, 30 of 37 experimental cesarean sections were performed on enslaved women in 1830. Next slide, please. But it wasn't just medical experimentation on the living. Enslaved people's dead bodies were dissected to advance medical science. This is an image of African American remains that were found in a well at Virginia Commonwealth University. In 2019, the remains were formally memorialized. Human remains of African Americans have been found at numerous medical school sites throughout the country. Next slide, please. Here's another advertisement from the Charleston Mercury, and this one reads, "No place in the United States offers as great opportunities for the acquisition of anatomical knowledge, subjects being obtained from among the colored population in sufficient numbers for every purpose and proper dissections carried on without offending any individuals in the community." Next slide, please. Harriet Martineau visited Baltimore and noted similarly that the bodies of colored people exclusively are taken for dissection because the whites do not like it and the colored people cannot resist. Enslaved people's bodies became part of a lucrative national cadaver trade that shuttled Black people's bodies from Texas to New Hampshire. As historian Dinah Ramey Berry writes, few enslaved people rested in peace. Death did not end their commodification. I will now show one photograph of a dissection, and I would just ask you to please avert your eyes as necessary because this is gruesome. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. While Black people's bodies were being used to advance medical science, there was another powerful discourse operative that claimed Black people were biologically inferior and innately different as a species, existing somewhere between the ape and the European. Race-based medicine took root in the United States as a product of these beliefs. False ideas about Black people's disease immunity and disease susceptibility circulated widely, and many today still believe false notions concerning medical and biological differences between Blacks and whites that developed during slavery, that Blacks feel less pain than whites, that Blacks have poorer pulmonary function, smaller skulls, weaker brains, thicker skin, and less prone to depression. Science simply does not support this. Yet false notions of racial difference continue to impact health outcomes for African Americans today. In fact, one of our founding fathers, Benjamin Rush, helped promote the idea that Black people don't feel the same level of physical pain as white people. Next slide, please. Dr. Benjamin Rush was the first professor of chemistry in the US and also published the first psychiatric textbook in the US. And he wrote the following in 1799. He believed Black skin was a form of leprosy, and he wrote that it caused morbid insensibility in the nerves, meaning that Black people were less sensitive to physical pain than white people. Next slide, please. Today, these ideas endure, and they have evolved. Some medical students still think Black patients feel less pain than whites. Next slide, please. Racial disparity seen in how doctors treat pain, even among children. Next slide, please. This is how Black people get killed. This refers to Dr. Susan Moore, an African American medical doctor who went to the hospital with COVID symptoms and died 2 weeks later. Her symptoms were not believed, and she was not given adequate pain medication. Dr. Moore said about the doctor that he made me feel like a drug addict. So you can see how in more recent decades, Black people's pain may be undertreated because of stereotyping Black people as drug addicts. Next slide, please. Slavery and the slave trade are crucial centuries for understanding this history of harm, where racial bias, disparate medical treatment, race-based medicine, and medical exploitation began to take root. Many who are listening to this hearing know how the story would continue into the 20th century and beyond. It may be part of your own family histories. Some of you may have experienced segregated healthcare in various parts of the country, whether by Jim Crow law or Jim Crow custom. Some of you may have been subjected to state-sanctioned sterilization. Some of you may know of Tuskegee, of grave robbing, of Henrietta Lacks, and so much more. And on the flip side, some of you may be among the African American healthcare providers and research scientists who have stepped into the breach for over 100 years, seeking to give equitable, compassionate care. You see, we have always fought back mightily. We can travel across time through history and recognize a troubling continuity of racial bias, disparate treatment, race-based medicine, and medical exploitation. If we are honest, we will acknowledge that when it comes to African Americans and the U.S. healthcare system, the relationship was broken from the very beginning. African American health has been compromised and under assault from many aspects of our society. But we must have the courage to look directly at our healthcare system as being complicit in this long history of harm. Ideas of Black inferiority continue to shape the medical care that African Americans receive. Biases and stereotypes continue to result in disparate treatment. Black women die because we are not listened to. Our pain is not taken seriously, as we can see with the crisis in Black maternal mortality. When I discuss this history with doctors, medical school students, residents, and frontline healthcare workers, I am always asked the same two questions. Why didn't I know this before? And why isn't this taught in medical school? I've been told that an historical perspective offers a diagnostic that helps them understand the present in a way that can be truly rehabilitative. Understanding the systems we've inherited and the legacies they have produced are crucial in making change happen. As an historian of medicine, science, and health, I don't believe we can begin to intelligently solve our problems if we don't know how long the problem has endured. Thank you so much for listening.
Dr. Roberts, for that incredibly moving and informative testimony. Thank you for also honoring enslaved African women and their, forced contributions to the state of medicine we have today. So thank you for that. Dr. Tina Sachs, you are recognized and you may begin when you are ready.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. May I have my slides, please? Are they up? Thank you so much. First, I want to just say thank you so much to Dr. Roberts. What an incredibly compelling, powerful, and moving testimony you gave. Thank you so much for laying the historical groundwork for us here. I also want to thank the task force for this also just incredibly powerful work that you are doing. Thank you so much for your continued commitment to the well-being of Black people, to African Americans, and thank you for doing this for the culture. I so deeply appreciate this, and I'm honored to be here. Next slide, please. So what I want to do today is tell a story. I want to tell us a story about health inequities among Black Californians in particular. Try to connect this story to the history of chattel slavery and to the present of anti-Blackness, and then try to bring us into a bit of a discussion of what repair might look like. I know that that is absolutely your charge and you are much more expert than I am, but I wanted to share a few ideas about how I think we may be able to move forward. Next, please. So here, these are just some data on the incredible racial and ethnic diversity that is present in the state of California. And you can see here that Black people in the state of California represent about 6% of the population of the state of California, and that has held true for the last several census and is projected to be the case up to 2040. Next slide, please. However, you can see here that although Black people only represent 6% of the population of the state, Black people are overrepresented among people who are living in poverty. So that's the second bar there, where you can see that Black people, 13% of all Black people in the state of California live in poverty. And even all the way up to up to 299% of poverty, you still see up to 50%, approximately 50% of the population in California, Black people in California living relatively close to the federal poverty threshold and venturing just a little bit above that. And so I think given the history of chattel slavery and the forced labor and certainly the extraction of labor without being compensated, that we still see some of the profound implications of that in the present in terms of socioeconomic status among Black people. Next, please. A shorthand that we often use in social welfare and in public health is that Black people live sicker and die younger. And unfortunately, that's what we see here. The life expectancy of Black Californians is still much lower than other Californians. And so you can see here on average, a Black Californian would live 75 years. And so especially as I'm getting up and up in my own years, I start to think, 75 years is not that long, and start to think about the ways in which, again, these structural arrangements or the intergenerational impact of slavery, the profound biases that are built into the system, our healthcare system, as well as the fact that Black people do not receive the same kinds of returns to education as white people, as their white counterparts. So you see here that there is a profound impact, it's literally on the physical body of Black people in terms of life expectancy. Next, please. So I apologize, these are a little bit small, but these are just another way of telling the story about Black people's well-being, again, in the state of California. So here you can see in this chart, preventable hospitalizations by race, that Black people, this is so small, I really apologize, but Black people tend to do worse in terms of all of these outcomes. So you have asthma, diabetes care, this is asthma for Black children as well as Black adults, angina, these are all conditions that can be prevented and treated. On the outpatient side, Black people tend to do worse in all of these dimensions compared to white Californians. You can also see here that this bar graph on the far left here, the blue bar is that represents Black people in the state of California who are much more likely to be readmitted to the hospital for conditions that were not adequately treated during the first inpatient hospitalization. And so here, you think about some of the issues that Dr. Roberts also mentioned about pain management, about biases that are deeply embedded within the healthcare system itself. And so you can see that Black people are deeply affected and deeply harmed by these biases. Next, please. These two graphs show similar outcomes. So you can see here that top graph is cancer early diagnosis. That is for breast cancer. And so that you can see that that Black women tend to be diagnosed a little bit later. Actually, Asian and Pacific Islander women are also diagnosed later as well, later than their white counterparts. And if you move over to the other chart, cancer deaths, you can see here that in all of these particular outcomes, particular cancer sites, breast, cervical, colorectal, lung, and prostate cancer, you can see that Black people also suffer overwhelmingly disproportionately higher rates than their white counterparts. In terms of even for cancer deaths due to prostate cancer, Black men are dying almost at 5 times the rate of white Californians. And so these are, again, literally coming down to matters of life and death. Next, please. Another issue that Dr. Roberts also touched upon for us was the issue of maternal well-being. And I think we've been frequently have heard of late in the media the ways in which Black women, Black people are treated in the prenatal and birthing outcome space. So Black women tend to not do very well in terms of getting sufficient prenatal care. In the first trimester, Black babies, you can see here, are also much more likely to be born preterm, and that puts Black children at risk for all kinds of additional health problems later on, including infant mortality. And so these maternal health and infant health outcomes taken together really sort of set the stage for Black well-being or Black ill health through the life course. Next, please. Here you can see the low birth weight and infant mortality outcomes for Black children, and you can see the blue bar here at the far left on both of these graphs represent Black low birth weight births and Black children who have died before their first birthday. And so here again in these data are from 2020, I believe. We still see these much different outcomes for Black people compared to other people in the state of California. And the state of California is considered to be a very progressive state. And we know that even in a very progressive state, that the inequality and the inequity and the biases that really began during the transatlantic slave trade, we see those, that they persist quite strongly in the present. Next, please. And here, maternal mortality. So the United States in general ranks very low, does very poorly in terms of maternal well-being and maternal health outcomes. And here you can see that Black women in California tend to die at a higher rate than their other California counterparts, than their white counterparts in particular. And this is something that I think I have been touched by personally. Much of my work is actually about how these differences in treatment persist across class, and so this is not only about poverty of African American women living in poverty, but these outcomes tend to persist across class, meaning that Black women with college degrees also are affected by this and have higher rates of infant mortality for Black women with college degrees, even compared to white women with high school diplomas only. And so we know that this is not only an issue of class, this is absolutely an issue of racism and sexism and the combination thereof called misogynoir. Next, please. And this is the last data slide here, but I wanted to show that, we know that in California, housing is a huge issue. And this is something that the state, I know, it has been grappling with. But just to think about the incredible disproportionality of Black people living on the street in the state of California, the 5th largest economy in the world, Black people are overwhelmingly more likely to be homeless than white people, white Californians, Asian Californians, and others. So you can see here that the rate of homelessness for Black Californians is about 172.7. For other people, for white people in California, it is 28.9. So this amount of disproportionality is it's profound. And I think we really need to think about all of the structural reasons that Black people are so much more likely to end up living on the street compared to others. Next, please. So certainly, as others have mentioned, Dr. Roberts has mentioned, many people have documented the relationship between slavery, the afterlife of slavery, and anti-Blackness. Of course, W.E.B. Du Bois is known as a sociologist, and as a sociologist and historian, but his work also he used very rigorous empirical methods to demonstrate the relationship between Black people's poor health and slavery, the afterlife of slavery, and the ongoing discrimination that Black people faced, particularly in his study, The Philadelphia Negro, and in the health and physique of the Negro American. Very importantly, W.E.B. Du Bois pushed back against the dominant tropes and explanations at the time, the pseudoscience at the time, that suggested that somehow Black people were simply biologically different and therefore biologically inferior, and this is why we were dying younger and living sicker. And so this work is, taking place, this work is published at the turn of the last century. And so it really is, as others have mentioned here today, the time is now. We have known about this for a long time. And it's really, I think, a matter of political will and power. And that's why I'm so grateful that you all are thinking so carefully about how to do this. And next, please. So just as we're trying to think about ways to repair this, I know this is your charge, but when I was asked to appear before you, it really made me think to think expansively about this. There are some, I should say, reparation strategies that already exist. Evanston, Illinois, in terms of housing reparations, I think was the first city to try to do this. The Claims Conference providing monetary compensation to people who were descendants of Holocaust survivors, and of course CARICOM. There are many ways to try to think about this, and I think taking an expansive view is critical. Next. So in addition to establishing some sort of, financial system, if that is indeed where you decide to go as a committee and as a task force, I do just want to mention that I think it's really important as we think about the implications of slavery, that we also really think about ceasing the ongoing harm that we all face here as Black people in the United States, particularly the ongoing consequences of slavery and anti-Blackness in terms of punishment, prisons, and police violence. This is a public health issue that is often overlooked in much of the data that I presented, but the implications of imprisonment on Black people and Black health is enormous, and I think we would do well to really consider that. And then to acknowledge and to not shy away from the very close causal relationship between anti-Blackness and poor health. Next. I also would be remiss if I didn't address or suggest that one of the ways to try to do something about health is to deal with both the social policy and social determinants of health that actually contribute to health, that really are the things that make us either healthy or not healthy. And so to think about using both universal and targeted approaches to expanding the safety net. We know that Black people are very vulnerable to, not having health insurance, to being unhoused. Black women typically, not having childcare subsidies is a big deal, and not having sick leave, and I apologize for the typo there. But these kinds of social policy issues would go a long way to improving Black people's health overall. Next. And just to close here, I wanted to just leave with this, that I really believe that a multifaceted approach that addresses both social determinants of health and anti-Blackness is critical, and that, another world is really possible. And I appreciate so much all of your efforts to usher in that new world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sachs, for your thoughtful expert testimony. We will now turn to Brett Andrews. Brett Andrews, you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you so very much. I just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear
Awesome.
you.
Thank you very, very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brett Andrews, and I'm thrilled and honored to be invited to participate in this health discussion of the task force. If we can please get the slides up. As I move through the presentation, I ask that you keep active in your mind the work that we are doing is primarily based in San Francisco. You'll find that having special considerations and an overlay and a lens that really makes it even more challenging and brings to light significant disparities that we're having in the Black African American community. Next slide, please. I came to San Francisco in 2003, and one of the things that I sought to do was get a very clear understanding of what city that I was moving into. After living in Los Angeles and New York, DC, and born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I read the census at the time, the narrative, and looked at the demographics. And what stuck out to me is that in a world-class city as San Francisco, at that time, the Black population was just hovering around 7 or 8%. And obviously we have shrunk to about 5%. And the question that stuck in my mind that remains today, as I haven't been able to sufficiently answer it, is either Black folks were here and they left, or they were never here, and neither or both, and neither would be a preferred outcome. And so I've paid attention to that as I've been with Positive Resource Center, PRC, for the last 19 years. I have been challenged to figure out what are the contributing factors to the challenges that we have in the African American Black community. I'll say a little bit about PRC. We started as a small HIV organization in 1987, AIDS benefits counselors in response to the AIDS crisis. We were primarily a law outfit, attorneys helping clients gain disability benefits that were being denied by the Social Security Administration. In the mid-90s, we acquired a workforce development program specifically focused on the HIV population, and came together as Positive Resource Center. As you can see, a very small budget with a powerful, mighty 7 employees who were doing extraordinary work in the community. I came on as their executive director at the time in 2003. And we had a budget of just about $1.2 million and 18 employees. And over the years, through natural growth and a couple mergers that we've had in the most recent years, we have grown that organization to about $34 million and 300 plus employees, and provide both behavioral health and HIV services in San Francisco. I will say that putting on an extra lens, obviously PRC is Black-led. It is one of the top 3 behavioral health organizations in size in San Francisco, and the largest behavioral health organization that is Black-led. Next slide, please. When we thought about bringing the organization together, there were obviously HIV programs and a series of behavioral health services that we were providing, including 9 licensed sites throughout San Francisco, providing 30, 60, and 90-day residential treatment care in substance use, mental health, and for those, there are a few that are co-occurring. And we organized our services to make sure that there was a continuum of care that went from crisis care, which are really street-based care, bringing folks in off of the street and out of psychiatric emergency services, to more stable residential treatment care. And then we do have about 140 beds of scattered site housing for people who have graduated out of the program and who are living long-term to permanent in our co-op system. We think about the determinants of health, the social determinants of health, and we took our social programs and made sure that there was a connection between those programs and our residential treatment care. Then we provide emergency financial assistance grants for clients who are experiencing a significant financial need, an immediate and urgent need, medical copays, cell phone bills, utility bills, and most importantly, where a significant amount of our dollars are going, is frankly for folks to stay in their apartments, paying for rent and security deposits. We provide, as I've mentioned earlier, legal advocacy services, workforce development services, which are career counseling, computer training, job search assistance, and job placement. And of course, very important, career peer counselors, folks who have the lived experience, who have been successful in going through the challenges and that they've had in their life, and finding themselves in a space of triumph and being a witness and a support to those who are going through the process now. And this continuum of care and its wraparound services really speaks to serving clients without the barriers of siloed funding, but really wanting to serve the person through a whole person care model. Next slide, please. In about 2000, just at about 2018, the Department of Public Health did its first Black African American Health Report. And as you can imagine, pretty much in every indicator, every metric, every index, African Americans came in last. And I put, while there are many startling statistics that are in that report, I pulled out a few of them that are just incredibly heartbreaking. And I again will remind you, we're talking about San Francisco that has a population of under 1 million, about 840,000. It has an annual budget of about 13.2 billion, which is more the size of a budget for Chicago. It has a pretty strong ideology and shared ideology. And we have a small population to deal with that is disproportionately being impacted in many ways. And so with African Americans, Black African Americans only making up 5% of the population, we make up 37% of the total homeless population. Embedded in that percentage is also about 25% of those who've been on the street for 10 years or longer. 19% of Black African Americans represent the behavioral health services, again, reflected against the 5% of the total population, Black African American total population. And while our unemployment are hovering around 3%, our unemployment rate in the African American community is about 18%. We are 2 times more likely to experience a disability in our lives, and we have a very low median income of about $30,000 a year. We have the lowest non-graduation rates at 63% versus a general 16%, highest mortality rate in 9 out of the top 10 causes of death in San Francisco. And as the presenter spoke to earlier, statewide, while we make up 6% of the state, we hold approximately $4,000 in general household wealth as compared to the white population with $355,000 as a household wealth. Next slide, please. That sparked a lot of discussion, obviously stirred up a lot of emotion for myself. And I thought while I was the CEO of PRC and proud to be in this role, there had to be something more that I could do. And if there was more that I could do, I knew that there were other caring Black leaders across the city who would be interested in this work. And so I reached out in 2019 to a group of 45 Black leaders and asked them to come and ask ourselves the question and challenge ourselves to come up with an answer of what we could do and how we could formalize an effort and an initiative to address some of these issues. Because again, San Francisco being a very wealthy city and county that has a significant amount of control, one would ask if all of that is those resources are at your fingertips and at your disposal, how in the world could you have such paltry outcomes compared to any other state, particularly those that are in the South? And we decided to form ourselves into the Black Leadership Council. And our mission is to advance meaningful change across our systems of care that have historically harmed Black health, wealth, and prosperity. And we seek to bring change through legislative and partnership strategies. And we are going to do this focusing on 4 policy pillars of health, wealth, housing, and education. All 4 of them referenced often throughout the previous presentations that we've heard. Next slide, please. Some of the great outcomes that we've had over the past 2 years is we have had a significant amount of meetings at the state level with legislators. We've supported 23 bills that are germane to the topic and have done public testimony throughout the last 2 years. We've supported some significant bills that we feel help to address racial inequities, SB 17, the establishment of the Office of Racial Equity, AB 1406 was Assemblyman Burke's bill with nurses and healthcare providers implicit bias, and SB 2, who I know Senator Bradford is on the call. And actually, we have the honor of having him come and present to us and allowing us to share with him our strategies and our goals and ways in which we can work together in order to address quite a significant existential issue that is in front of us. And that particular bill on the civil rights around officers and certification, just greater accountability in officers' behavior. We made some recommendations that fit within our prosperity agenda, thinking about debt relief provisions that hold back the Build Back Boldly budget that we are thinking about, CDE, which is alternative solutions for preschool expulsions and suspensions, and certainly capacity building and trainings that we're looking for in Black-led organizations. Next slide, please. So what are some of the critical social issues that we are facing? There are many, but these, again, germane to the work that we are doing here at PRC and in San Francisco. We recognize that there was an apology that did come out from the American Psychological Association that said that they indeed recognize that they played an active role in creating, sustained, and promoted a view of people of color as deficient or damaged. And we, again, saw that in our previous presentations. And so there is a history of misdiagnoses of Black African Americans. We know that there is a lack of diversity in the medical field. And while we make up about 13% of the US population, we only make up about 5% of the physicians in the United States. The disproportionate representation of homelessness and behavioral health issues. There's with a significant rise in San Francisco, and San Jose, and in Oakland. There's a 9% rise overall in homelessness since 2019. And importantly, while African Americans are facing these challenges, we know that there's another challenge that is above it that lives in an institutional level, that there is a history of underfunding Black-led organizations. And we have found in a recent study that they are about 24% smaller in revenue and have less opportunity to access significant funds in order for them to provide their service to the fullness of their capacity. Next slide, please. So I would like to present to the task force a few ideas and recommendations on research and investments and thinking about where we should go from here. I think that we should spend some time thinking about the need for significant investments in Black-led organizations that are serving our California's diverse populations and communities that have a cultural lens put to them, that are meaningful and community-based. I think that we should create more diversity in the workforce, a pipeline of medical and behavioral health professionals to address the cultural considerations of clients served in Black-led behavioral health and other health organizations. I believe that we should require ongoing meetings with national health associations like the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and others to create joint educational and research opportunities. We should conduct comprehensive reviews of healthcare policies within governmental entities to unveil where and how implicit and explicit racist policies and practices are embedded in the creation and the provision of services. We should create and deepen relationships with faith-based organizations and institutions as a primary place to do outreach in the community. I want to say a word about that, and I know Member Brown is on and Reverend Brown is on, and I believe, and I know he supports this, that we should focus energy and attention on bringing the secular work and the faith-based work together, because so much of our lives are tied to the cultural and spiritual dynamics that are active in our lives. And I think about that in the HIV work that we have done and continue to do, and what role the church can play in elevating those conversations and bringing people together who might not come together otherwise to talk about serious, critical health-related issues. And then I think we should enlist public figures to elevate and broaden the discussion of health equity by sharing their stories and making strategic investments in the community. We saw that when Magic Johnson was courageous and brave enough to come out and share his HIV status, and then put his money where his mouth is and create a series of community-based clinics where, if indeed he had not had the courage and the bravery to speak his truth and his reality, that so many people would have died because of it, and they would have died with it, believing that it is their secret and their secret alone. So I do encourage all of us who have some level of influence as a leader in the community to speak your truth, as certainly as an individual, as a community leader, and in the professional role that you are in. I do believe storytelling is important, and I believe stepping into the fullness of our truth can go a long way and help countless individuals. With that, I'm going to stop there, and I just want to thank everybody for their time, for their courageous work and discussions. I know that it is difficult because we represent what we are trying to solve. And one of the things that we talked about at the Black Leadership Council is, in the storytelling, in doing the work, let's not ignore the fact that we ourselves are human and that we are suffering through it, and how great it is that we have come together to go through this struggle together, knowing that collaboratively that we can come to the other side. And so again, with that, I thank you all for your time and your attention to this critical issue, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews, for your compelling and insightful expert testimony. We will now turn to our last expert witness for this panel, and then we will turn to comments and questions from our esteemed task force members. So Melissa Jones is our last panelist. Melissa Jones, you may begin your testimony when you're ready. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here to talk to you today and talk about a bit about how we move from recognition of all the harms to repair. And it's been, I know, a long road for many of us in that discussion. I am Melissa Jones from BARHI. I'm the executive director here. Next slide, please. BARHI is the coalition of the Bay Area's governmental public health departments. We were founded when 4 sitting public health directors took a deep look at the data around life expectancy by race, class, and geography, and saw decade-long differences between particularly African-American communities, particularly low-income African-American communities, and the richer, whiter communities within zip codes. The group really looked and thought very deeply about what could bring about a change to that decade-long difference, and developed a series of strategies that have been in place to move this forward. Next slide, please. And those strategies have really shaped much of health equity, both in the Bay Area and in the country. And so here I have the differences in the United States, in California, in the Bay Area, and in the other regions of our country of life expectancy by race. But since the last 2 folks also talked about that, I'm going to go to the next slide and talk a bit about the BARHI framework. The BARHI framework is based on a lot of the same data and information that's been adopted by the World Health Organization to explain differences in life expectancy. And it's really based in this idea that the living conditions, institutional inequities, and social inequities that shape our experience have a great deal to do with the mortality differences that we see. Indeed, the World Health Organization says 80% of the cause of the differences that we see. And this is a framework that's been adopted and widely used by a number of influential organizations in health, and is really accepted as a standard of understanding what is causing these large differences in life expectancy that we see. The inaugural framework for the California Department of Public Health's Office of Health Equity, guiding their first strategic plan and grant making. It's used in public health accreditation nationally across the country and through the National Association of City and County Health Officers for their planning around the MAP accreditation process. And it's used by the American Medical Association in their health equity unit focused on their most recent health equity plan. Slide, please. And it really holds, next slide, please. Yes, and it really holds to that focus on the 80%. Slide, please. And we often talk about the, back one, thank you. We often talk about the social determinants of health and their incredible direct line impact to health, right? Disparities in education, in engagement with the criminal justice system. But I want to talk about a much more personal piece of the health equity pieces of the work, how it travels in a family. And so there is now very clear research on the impact of racism on health. And in particular, on the way that cortisol has located itself in our bodies in a response to acts of racism and in response to racism. So cortisol, you probably know, is a stress hormone, can be activated and released over an extended period of time for many reasons. It creates this sort of pressure, this sort of swirl in the body. And studies have found that African American adults have sort of flatter cortisol slopes from wake up to bedtime than their average white counterparts. These flattened slopes are linked to poor emotional and physical health and really contribute to issues of cardiovascular disease. And that's now very well established. There's been a meta-analysis of 80 studies across all ages, ranging from children to adults. So it's a very big and clear way that the racism that undergirds our full history from slavery through to the present really creates personally in our body this very heavy burden. Next slide, please. And these heavy burdens, when they do bring us to the doctor's office, bring us to a doctor's office not well prepared to meet our needs. And so here you see some data similar to data that somebody spoke about a bit earlier in the conversation that's focused on white medical learners' enduring beliefs about biological differences between Blacks and whites. This is data from 2016, so it's very recent data. And it shows by percentage and by medical year, beliefs around that we feel less pain, right? That we have stronger immune systems, a range of things that can lower a doctor's attention, both to our ailments and to what needs to happen next. And next slide, please. And we know this anecdotally too. We know that almost half of African Americans in California report that they have experienced unfair treatment due to race. We know that NAM has found that racial and ethnic minorities receive lower quality health care than whites, even when insurance holds even and similar insurance status, income, age, and severity of condition. And we know that in surveys of hospitals across the country that Black patients with heart disease receive older, cheaper, and more conservative treatments than their white counterparts. Next slide, please. And this shows up in our maternal health outcomes as well, as was mentioned earlier. So I'll just mention one. One thing that we know is, for example, for Black babies in the Bay Area, similar to other parts of California, we're two times more likely to be born too soon, too small, or to die before the first year of birth. Next slide. We also know that there are things that change that outcome. And one of the most comprehensive studies that's been done on that fact across 1.8 million hospital records from 1992 to 2015 show that infant mortality rate is cut in half. And it's cut in half when a Black doctor is the primary charge on these cases. And that brings me to the piece of the conversation around health that we often don't have, which is that the injustices in other parts of our system land in our healthcare system. And so the injustices in our public education system that result in a fewer number of Black doctors result in an unmet need for Black doctors that really could be part of a cycle of changing the birth outcomes that we see. And that's just one example of how an injustice in one part of the sector will come to show up in health. And it's a very important example for our life expectancy. Next, please. And these examples of both the incredible injustice in differences in life expectancy, the direct relationship of that to the racism that we've experienced across history and into the present day, and the fact that we do know there are solutions that are based in community provision of care, has really given rise to a movement nationally and here in California focused on racism itself as a public health issue. And so on April 8th, 2021, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, CDC director, issued a statement that racism is a serious public health threat and recognized the important role of the CDC in addressing the impact of racism on public health. In the time subsequent and since then, over 200 jurisdictions and over 30 states have now declared racism as a public health issue. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide. It's 2 taps, I think, for everything to come through. Thank you. And so as we think about addressing racism as a root cause and think about ending our differences in life expectancy, I think that there's great lessons from housing and issues of affirmatively furthering fair housing. I think what housing has told us over time is that laws help, that enforcement works better, right? That we need the combination of the two, and that even with the combination of the two, redressing the harm is the only thing that would really close the gap. We've seen that in home ownership, in purchasing, in lending disparities, and in apartment rentals. And so it's really thrilling to be able to talk to you all, because I know you're thinking really about redressing the harm that has been a burden on Black Californians for such a long time. Next slide, please. And so I end again with the differences on life expectancy, how they've pulled through the historical moments into a piece of harm. Next slide, please. And want to talk a little bit about the bright spots, the things that might indicate for us just what the potential of reparations is for our health. And so policies that reduce poverty and raise wages of low-income people can be expected to significantly improve overall health and reduce health inequities. There's been a lot of research on that by us and by others, and that negative economic shocks cause mental illness, and anti-poverty programs such as cash transfers really bump up and improve mental health. And then an assessment from the Stockton demonstration on basic income. After 1 year of cash payments, there was a significant reduction in anxiety and depression compared to levels seen in the control group. So as much as the $500 that they provided was as effective as other forms of medication. Now, I'm not suggesting that that be the number. I think the redress of the harms cumulative over the structural impacts from housing to education to health are much larger. But the idea that cash in and of itself has this protective factor for health, and it is one of in income and wage is one of the longest harms sort of generationally passed from slavery is really, I think, an important piece. Next slide, please. And so I just share 3 bright spots, similar to the fact that we know Black doctors are having such a dramatic impact in lowering infant mortality. I also want to share several other programs that are coming from community that seem to be having really promising potential for reducing the disparities that we've seen in health, all of which are tied to conversations about repair and in particular, cash reparation. One is the Magnolia Mothers Trust out of Jackson, Mississippi, which has been providing guaranteed income programs for mothers in Jackson with similar outcomes to what we've seen in Stockton in terms of relief of stress, better improved health outcomes, a longer opportunity to spend time finding the right job and sort of getting a job that pays more by being able to hold out a little bit longer and go to that next couple of rounds of interviews, the kinds of things that give people flexibility. the kinds of flexibility it's hard to have when we don't have the generational wealth of other communities. The second is the Abundant Birth Project, which provides unconditional monthly income supplements of $1,000 to approximately 150 Black and Pacific Islander mothers in San Francisco. This is a project that's just starting. It's something that we have our eye on. It's got a very robust evaluation that goes with it to help us see the change in outcomes that we can see, these very important life and death outcomes. And then the last is Barhai's Black Hat Initiative, where we've worked with 40 Black-led developers and housing finance people from across the Bay Area to really take a look at the massive pattern of Black displacement that we've experienced in the Bay, from San Francisco to Berkeley, now here in Oakland, that has really shaped and changed the Bay Area. And we've come up with a plan that really focuses on an end to that mass displacement through Black-led development and Black planning for the Black Bay Area in terms of community and housing, to create communities of health, prosperity, and justice. And so each of these are the kinds of investments we think could be really powerful health promoting activities that we really believe there's been now a body of research to really support their potential if scaled. Next slide, please. And thank you. With that, I'll end. And I just want to thank you so much for your time today, and look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Melissa Jones, for your excellent expert testimony. So we have 15 minutes reserved for this witness panel on public health. And so now I would like to turn to our esteemed task force members in the event that we have any questions or want to provide any comments or insight based on the expert testimony from Dr. Roberts, Dr. Sachs, Brett Andrews, and Melissa Jones. Please mute your phone. And I would also like to recognize Assemblymember Reggie Jones Sawyer. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. And actually, I'm sorry I missed the first part of this because I was in an assembly session, but I think my colleague from the Senate was able to get there and listen to Dr. Weber. I want to thank this group for coming in and really giving us some more information and things we can work on. As you may or may not know, I'm the chair of public safety for the state of California. And when I first got there, one of the things that struck me, since you mentioned San Francisco, is that I was told by my white counterparts in San Francisco that we really needed to do something about cannabis and the arrest of cannabis. Because in San Francisco, 60% of the people who were arrested for cannabis were African Americans, but they only made up 6% of the population, which means they were very intentional about putting criminal jackets and using the criminal justice system to keep our people down so that we could stay separated. We wouldn't get the kind of medical care we can have. We couldn't build wealth. We couldn't keep families together. The whole prison industrial complex is really another form or an advanced form, I believe, of slavery in the plantation system, which we can give all the money, we can do everything we can, even the stuff that you're talking about. But if we don't dismantle that in a substantive way with our people, they will continue to use that to keep our people down. And so in your research, when you looked at just the whole criminal justice system, and I know most of you are just thinking of what happened to George Floyd. This system is so insidious that just giving you a record means you can't rent an apartment. You may not be able to go to college. You may not, I mean, it is a spiraling thing that we can do all of this. We can provide a whole lot of money to every descendant of slave or whatever, but the system is set up, especially in the criminal justice system, that it could all be taken away in a flash. And what really bothered me is my district now not only encompasses Skid Row, it also have Nickerson Gardens, Jordan Downs, the projects. And when I was younger and doing kind of a tour of Nickerson Gardens, I noticed the gates that were outside, the pointed end that went like around, pointed inside to keep people in, not outside to keep people from coming in. It struck me